On this episode of Unanswered Questions, we are going back to Antarctica to answer 13 more questions about John Carpenter's The Thing from Another World. I had so many additional questions that were asked of me and that I had written down after my previous video, plus a few challenges that I wanted to answer, and I figured it was time to go back to the well and see if we can answer 13 more of these things. So let's give it a shot, and we're gonna ask these questions and try and answer them. And you know what? If we get them wrong, well then we're wrong. Question number 1. What happened to Nals? At the end of the movie, after Gary is killed, Nals wanders off alone to investigate and is just never seen again. So what happened to him? Well, obviously he was killed, but if he was taken over by the Thing, wouldn't there be a duplicate of him around? Well, not necessarily, and I think this reveals a crucial misunderstanding of how the Thing works. People often think the Thing just attacks you and takes you over and you're a duplicate now, but Blair breaks it down earlier. The creature absorbs you, it eats you, and then can change its own shape to look like whatever it has eaten. Take a look at this computer simulation. The Thing cell completely devours the uninfected cell and then changes its own shape to look like it. So when the alien takes Gary and Nals at the end, we have to assume that it completely absorbs them. We don't see what Blair looks like when he attacks Nals, so we don't know what form he has taken, but this actually answers a completely different question that was asked, and that was where all the extra matter comes from with the Thing's final form. The Thing shouldn't be able to just create new matter out of nothing, just reshape its own matter to look like what it's previously imitated. So when you're seeing this huge thing that's the size of several people, that's because it probably actually is several people. This is the Blair creature after ingesting the additional matter of Gary and Nals. It hasn't chosen to duplicate them as yet because it's not strategic, but we do see it using that matter to try to imitate one of the dogs from earlier, as its tactic was probably going to be to try to escape into the wild like it did in the beginning of the movie. So, if you're looking for Nals, well, he's somewhere in here. Question number 2. Was the Thing the pilot of the spaceship in the beginning? This one is a bit of a head-scratcher since we have so little information about it and most of it is up to our imaginations, but there is a bit of evidence in the film itself and a bit more of a definitive answer if we take the prequel and information from it into account. In the original film, all we see is the ship crash in the very beginning, and it appears to be having some troubles on the way down. We can infer plenty from this, but no real answers because it could have been anything from plain old engine trouble to a full-scale fight on the ship. We never get into the ship to see any details about what went on, and the Thing itself is the only inhabitant that we meet. Judging from its ability to create the craft under the ice, we have to assume that it's some form of intelligent species, so it's not silly to think that it could have been the pilot able to fly the ship. It's also that it could have been on the ship and a mostly unintelligent parasitic organism that got loose after the crash, or even before the crash and causing it. Considering that we have to assume that the Thing is able to at least absorb partial memory and intelligence from what it absorbs, there's every possibility that it took over an alien elsewhere with the ability to fly the ship, so the chances of it being alone on the ship are also pretty good. As far as the original movie is concerned, the answer can pretty much be whatever you like it to be. In my headcanon, I think the creature was alone on the ship, mainly because of what we see later with Blair. The creature's tactic is to get into areas of greater population, creating transportation to get there as necessary. I like to think it was on another world and either ran out of subjects to assimilate or had to escape and either created or stole the ship to get to greener pastures in this case. Now that's different if you take the prequel into account, or rather, some versions of it. In the original version, before the CGI Tetris overlay, we actually saw the pilot of the ship, and in an interview, the director of the film revealed the intended backstory. According to him, the intention was that the Thing was an alien experiment with no true shape of its own, and was being held on the ship. It escapes, of course, taking over the crew and eventually leading to the crash. So, basically, a version of the film also occurred on that craft before it landed on Earth. So if someone wants to make a prequel to the prequel, I guess it would be that. Again, none of this is truly canon since it didn't even make it into the version of the prequel that we saw, so if you're against this series of events, it's still cool. It still makes sense. Question number 3. Why didn't the Thing infect Doc Copper when the Norris Thing attacked him? So, Copper is killed in what is possibly the film's biggest wow moment as the Norris creature opens its belly and eats his arms. There's plenty of physical contact, so why wouldn't it infect him at this point? When they do the blood test later on in the film, they test Copper's blood and nothing happens, which means that he's not infected. This right here is just another reason why I don't believe in the single cell theory and believe that the Thing actually has to fully ingest you before it can duplicate you. Copper's arms were eaten by the creature, so they're in there and the creature can possibly create a duplicate, but the rest of his body is dead. If the Thing was capable of taking over someone from just a general touch, and it has been suggested, I think this counts as a touch. So Copper should have been infected, but he wasn't. I know some will claim that the creature was being strategic in not infecting the Doc, but there's no way at that point that it would have known about the possibility of a blood test, as Mac came up with that much later, and the creature thought that it had destroyed the usable blood. The reason it doesn't affect Copper is that's not how the creature works. It has to ingest you before duplicating you. Copper's still uninfected since he wasn't absorbed at any point, except his arms, but they're no longer attached to his body. So maybe there wasn't enough of the Thing in his system for the blood test to take effect. I guess you could say that, but I think that's a pretty big misunderstanding of the way the Thing works, and we'll discuss that in the very next question. Question number 4. So yeah, how does the Thing work? Man, this is a tough question because we see so little of how the creature works, but we can make quite a few educated guesses based on what we see, and most of our info comes from Blair, but our first info comes from the dogs. We see the dog Thing spray some of the other puppers with some sort of fluid. Not really sure what the purpose of this stuff is, or if it was important to the takeover process. It looks like some of the dogs that end up alive get some on them, but they're killed later on by Blair with a regular axe, which most likely means that they weren't infected, or duplicates. As you most likely know from my last video, I'm not a proponent of the single cell theory and the dogs getting Gallaghered here, and still not being a Thing creature seems to indicate that. We next see in the autopsy scene that the dog Thing had already ingested what Blair insinuates is more than one dog. They are inside the Thing, and he says that it was in the process of imitating them. Also, take a look at Blair's simulation, which is often used as evidence of the single cell theory, but the simulation shows an infected cell completely devouring and then actually duplicating the cell. This, combined with what he says in the autopsy scene, cements this as more than just an infection. The Thing doesn't take over yourself, it duplicates it. Think of it like a copy machine that destroys the original. You have a copy of it in a paper tray, but your original is gone. On a cellular level, this would be the equivalent of a cancerous mass, an invader in your body. The second it was bigger than a golf ball, your body would basically shut down. Think of it as the equivalent of someone chopping off your arm and replacing it with itself. It's not your arm. It's a foreign invader attached to you. We see at the end of the movie that after the creature ingests you, it is able to use that excess mass to break off a piece of itself. The Blair creature was using the added mass of Gary and Nals to become a dog again, most likely to escape into the cold, so it can self-reproduce. This gives an interesting perspective to the death of Windows, as you can see him being devoured by the Thing. And not just his head, which is really in there, but his appendages are all being sucked in as well. It's probable that his upper body had been devoured, and the creature has basically replicated itself onto him here. The Thing on the ground is no longer Windows at all, it's a Thing basically finishing its meal and trying to give itself a complete body. The cool thing about this movie is that there's no full depictions of what happens, so we have to fill in the blanks, and there's a lot of gray area, but the one thing that appears to be consistent is that the creature has to ingest you first before imitation. The whole concept of retained memory is pretty apparent as well, considering the Blair Thing retained the knowledge of the dog form within it, which is part of why I believe that the Thing is a hive mind. The way they describe it, a cluster of living independent cells, would really only work as a hive mind, with a central intelligence guiding the pieces, otherwise they'd constantly be at odds with each other. So, when it separates into individual pieces, it's still one central being. So when you see Palmer rat out the alien head, it's sacrificing a small part for the good of the whole. If not, I don't see any reason why the creature would bother making duplicates of itself. If they worked independently of each other and occasionally at cross purposes, it would be counterproductive to create more adversaries for itself. Question number 5. So Blair made this thing under the cabin, but how was he going to get it out? The Blair thing has built this ship, which is either a small craft to escape Earth or, more likely, as I said in my previous video, a means of reaching an area of higher population, although it appears to be the equivalent of painting yourself into a corner. The creature dug out this little room, and the only entry is the one hallway, which is clearly not big enough for the ship to fit through, so wouldn't it be seemingly stuck down there? Well, not necessarily. Don't forget, we're dealing with a shapeshifter here. The Blair creature had less than a day or two and is able to dig out these tunnels in a large room underneath the cabin. That is a lot of digging, so you'd have to assume that it needed to alter its shape to do so, probably using large alien claws or something. I'm kinda glad the movie doesn't show this because the visual in my head of Wilford Brimley with monster hands shoveling snow seems kinda silly. The creature's plan at this point is to simply kill the rest of the crew, which it almost succeeded in doing, and once it finished, it would have simply used whatever shape it took to dig out the cave to dig out an entry port for the craft. Question number 6. So what happened to the blood after the blood test? So after the infamous blood test scene, there's a portion of the creature that is separated from the whole and part of the test. It obviously reacts to being burned and animates, but is never really seen again. So what happens to it? So, as I mentioned before, I happen to think that the creature is a hive mind, and I think that its primary goal is self-preservation, so this tiny portion of itself doesn't really have much of a chance. The last time we see it, it appears to be alive and running away, pouring in the same direction. Now, it's entirely possible that this tiny portion could live on and took refuge somewhere in the camp, but again, the fact that none of the crew seem to show the slightest concern for it or its whereabouts, my theory is that when you see it pouring in one direction, it's pouring towards Palmer. I think that the smaller portion, in order to try to survive, rejoined the larger portion. This is something that we haven't really seen before, but it's kind of obvious when you think about it. If this creature's form is malleable and able to divide into separate beings, you'd have to guess that it would be able to combine back into one larger form, like a really, really gross Voltron. We can probably guess that the team witnessed this happening while Palmer was transforming, which is why they don't mention it again after this point. Question number 7. This might be a quick one, but several people in the comments asked, but what about the tendrils in the dog kennel scene? Did they get out? There's a shot when Clark arrives at the kennel where several hentai tentacle looking things shoot out and attack him, and I think there's the impression that they may escape, so let's take a look at it. In the scene, Clark approaches the door and one of the dogs escapes. Right after, several tendrils slither through the open door, but do they escape? I don't think so. Take a look here and we see Clark close the door on them, causing them to retreat back into the room. Later on, when the crew arrives, we see one of the dogs held captive by several of the same spaghetti-looking things, and these tendrils are attached to the main body of the dog thing, and I think it's safe to assume that the ones in the doorway were as well. The closing of the door injured them slightly, so they withdrew, either back into the body of the creature, or they refocused their attentions to the dogs. I assume if they were separate entities and were able to get out, Clark probably would have made mention of that to the rest of the guys, especially since we later get confirmation that Clark is human. So I think it's safe to declare that no pieces were able to escape from the kennel. Question number 8. What about the idea that the thing's intelligence increases with its size? So I've read from a couple different sources online that it's considered Fannin. I guess this is what it's referred to when a group of fans of a piece of fiction collectively decide on a canon interpretation of a piece of a work that's not necessarily spelled out in the work itself. That the bigger the thing is, the smarter it can be. It's theorized that smaller portions of it don't possess the intelligence level of the larger whole and function on a more rudimentary level. Evidence for this in the film are represented by the blood thing, which gives itself away, and the head thing, which doesn't seem very subtle in its method of escape. As for me, well, I'm not a fan of the word Fannin, and I'm not a fan of this theory. Like I said earlier, I believe that the creature is part of a greater hive mind and contains a shared intelligence, and I've given my rationale for that in a previous answer. The blood thing reacts not because it lacks intelligence, but because it has to. It's hurt. If it contained no active intelligence, then what reason would it have for remaining still in the dish beforehand? The act of imitating blood and remaining still requires an intelligence in order to keep up the subterfuge. The head thing pulls away from the heat of the flame in order to survive and grows legs to give it mobility, again, an act of intelligence, even if a rather minor one. Its timing for escaping is pretty suspect, but it's acting in desperation and took a shot at either being discovered running away or discovered chilling under a desk, as you would have to figure that the team would notice it after long anyway. But that's all circumstantial, you say, and open to interpretation, and that's true, but I'll point to one other thing. Pun intended. And that thing is the dog. The dog is seemingly extremely intelligent for a dog, scheming and plotting, waiting for just the right time to infect the solitary crew member, and knowing to not take over Clark because he'd be the most suspected, so it's obvious that it's still highly intelligent at this size. Granted, it's still not as small as the head was, so it's still possible it's achieved the size it needs for intelligence, but again, it's open to interpretation, and my interpretation leads me to a full-size intelligence at any size. Okay, so that was 8 questions, all kinda new, but for these last couple, they're all gonna focus on one thing, and that is your responses to my views of the film's end. And if you missed it, I declared, based on elements within the film itself, that both Mac and Childs were definitively human. And man, did I get a lot of arguments back. Well, actually, I got the same 5 arguments back, but I got each of those arguments about 500 times. So let's look at them. Question number 9. If Childs is human, then why can't you see his breath? Well, you can. Let's look at the scene. As the two are talking, the cold air is making Mac's breath visible as he speaks, but when Childs talks, there's no visible breath. Because of this, there's a lot of discussion about it being proof that Childs is not human, except none of that makes sense. First of all, the creatures are perfect imitations. They duplicate our organs exactly. Why wouldn't its breath be visible? Well, there's an easy answer for this, and the answer is not some secret message from the movie that was meant to tip you off, because various members of the production team, including actor Keith David, have all said that it's not. You see, the ending was a bit of a mess, including quick shooting and some rewriting. While they were filming, the temperatures were all over the place, and the set was warmer when they were shooting the Childs angles, and cooler while doing Mac's. Second of all, you actually can see his breath. Take a look at when he first arrives. Plenty of breath there, even more visible when you watch it on the Blu-ray, so if the breath theory is correct, that would mean the creature actually willingly chose to do this, which, yeah, that doesn't make any sense either. Third of all, you really want to put this whole theory to bed? Well, here's the Bennings thing. Or wait, if you can't see a thing's breath, I guess this is actually a human here. So please, no more comments about not seeing Childs' breath. Question number 10. Okay, so then why didn't Childs have a gleam of life in his eye? Okay, this is another one that got posted about 400 times, and that's the fact that cinematographer Dean Cundy said in an interview that one of the clues that they had intended was to have a little gleam of light in the people who were human and none in those that were things. Unfortunately, for this theory to be true, you'd have to assume that Palmer is not a thing here, even though it's shortly before he's revealed to be one. Also, that Blair isn't one when he's killing Gary. The Norris thing isn't one, and neither is the dog. Let's face it, if they were intending this to be used as evidence, it just didn't work, and you'd have to hold it to its inconsistency. You can't tell me that Childs having no eye gleam makes him a thing if the other things actually have them, so no, sorry, that one doesn't work either. Question number 11. Yeah, but what about that bottle of gasoline? Here's another theory posted so many times I lost count, and that's the bottle at the end. Now there's actually two parts to this question, and the first revolves around the theory that the bottle is actually full of gasoline or kerosene, like the Molotov cocktails they were using earlier, and Childs drinking it proves that he's a thing. First though, if it's not alcohol in the bottle, why was Mac about to take a swig right here? Suicide? I mean, I guess you could say that he was faking it to try to pull a con on Childs, but it sure doesn't seem like he even knows he's there. So Mac would have to be faking not seeing him, feigning surprise, and then setting up the bottle thing, which is way more forethought than we've seen from MacReady in the entire film so far. This is a guy who just a few minutes ago didn't notice Nals walking away from him and getting killed and only reacted afterwards, but now he's like some master stealth strategist? Nah. Plus, why the hell wouldn't a thing be able to tell the difference between alcohol and kerosene? Because it's an alien and never tasted kerosene? Dude, it speaks English. It knows how to operate Earth machinery. It's duplicated the human organs, and guess what? Taste buds are part of that, and it's clearly assimilated, at the very least, core memories of those it ingests, so why wouldn't it be able to distinguish alcohol? But the other part of this is, why would Childs drink it knowing that a single cell can take over a person? Well, there's certainly possibilities such as Childs not being clued in on that detail, or not remembering, or just straight up not believing that a single cell can take someone over. After all, Fuchs said a small amount, not a single cell. And it's clear the group doesn't even really believe it, considering they used the same damn scalpel to cut into each other's thumbs with. But Mac laughs, which was a clear indication that it was intended. His chuckle was an acknowledgement of knowing his opponent is infected. But let's go deeper. I've already stated that I think Childs is human based on the key clue that he's even talking to Mac in the first place. There's just no reason for the thing to approach Mac at this point when its goal is to go to sleep in the snow, so why risk approaching? It's not just me either. The film's producer Stuart Cohen said that they actually had no clue if either of them were duplicates while they were filming it, and said that any interpretations of film elements were not intended. He stated that the ending was reworked and re-edited so many times that reading into any clues, and I should point out that he specifically pointed out the breath and the passing of the bottle, were not intended as clues, and any interpretation of them as such were missing the point. Also, a quick note that Keith David swears that Childs is human.
Anyway, like I said, it wasn't me.
And also throws in the very helpful note that the ending was filmed several different ways, but the performance that you see in the film is from when both actors were told to act as if both actors were human.
I just remember, it ain't me. And we now that you mention it, we did film it a couple of ways, but ultimately he said, you play it like it's not you. You play it like it's not you. And that's how we wound up playing. So we didn't know.
So if you see Kurt Russell laughing as him knowing that Childs is a thing, well, you, sir, are calling Mr. Russell a bad actor. And we do not stand for that kind of talk in this household. Question number 12. But what about Childs' jacket? Yes, the whole thing about Childs and his jacket. There's a few facets to this one. First of all, there's the color of his jacket, which seemingly changes when he shows back up. And then there's that hallway shot with the missing jacket. Let's address the jacket color first, because that's the most easily debunked. When we see Childs by the door, he's wearing a puffy navy jacket, and we see him again at the end, the jacket appears to be a different color. But note that the scene is lit by the cool red tones of the fire nearby, while the scene earlier is lit by the bright blue tones of the indoor lighting. Watch what happens when we take the end scene and color correct it to take away that red tone from the fire. See that? It's the same blue coat, covered by a dusting of snow. But what about that blue jacket that's missing in the shot where Childs is absent from the door, and why would he run away right after if Blair is in the generator saying he saw Blair in the snow? Don't those things prove it? Well, this shot kinda echoes that of the dog from earlier, except for one thing, the choppiness of the shot makes it seem like we're actually seeing a POV shot. It's a little unclear, but it seems to me, especially because our next shot is Childs going through the door we just saw, that the shot is Childs' POV. He looks down at the generator room and then goes back to the door. We next see Childs outside going to look for Blair. But what do we know about Childs? Well, this is the guy that was willing to gamble the life of MacReady, an innocent man, earlier in the film for his own protection. His exact words in response to the question of if they're wrong about him and if he's innocent is,
"Why then we're wrong?"
That implies that Childs is a little more concerned about his own skin than those around him. If he heard a noise down in the generator, he may have just basically ran away. It's already an established element of his character that he would rather avoid confrontation and is willing to neglect the well-being of his coworkers to do so. He doesn't show up again until the action is done, and he probably feels safe enough, which would be totally in character. But what about that missing jacket? Well, it's certainly compelling, and I've read and seen enough about the clothing continuity theory to at least consider it, but also consider this. In this scene, Norris and Palmer have their hoods down, but then they don't. In this shot, Mac has a hood on. But then it's gone. I mean, hell, there's this scene where everyone is talking about the Norwegian camp and they decide to go, and Fuchs and Palmer are right here, but when Gary and Copper go to get Mac right after, somehow the guys are also right here, and they've magically gone on about 8 layers. Fuchs is wearing a different top, and they're snow-covered. The whole essence of this scene is that they're in a hurry to get there, so Copper and Gary taking that much longer to get out there doesn't make sense, especially since it looks like they've been standing there for at least a little while, as they've got a dusting of snow on them. What I'm getting at is that the film is full of continuity errors, and again, Stuart Cohen is on record saying that any hints in the filmmaking that would point to either answer is purely unintentional. So thinking that they intentionally planted that jacket clue to tip people off is counter to what they've said. What's that? You're still not convinced? Okay, then let's take a closer look at that shot. Is this blue jacket really missing? If the whole point of this theory is called the clothing continuity theory, the blue jacket is right here, next to the window. On the other side of the window is a dark green jacket, and then next to that is a tannish looking coat. On the other side of the door appears to be a lighter colored jacket with a navy hood, or if there's another navy jacket here right next to it or something. There are 3 pairs of boots visible here as well. These ones are facing the wall, and this pair is facing out. Later on, the blue jacket is indeed missing. Or is it? There's this tan parka hanging on the very same hook now, so it's not gone. It's just been replaced. That first green jacket has moved hooks now, and the tan jacket has been swapped out for another green one. The jacket on the other side of the door lost its blue hood, and that jacket now seems to be next to it instead. There's still 3 pairs of boots, but one has been knocked down, and 2 pairs of them have been turned around to face the other way. So if you're citing the blue coat as evidence that something happened, you now have to explain why the creatures would have taken time to move this jacket over, place this one here, swap this one, and then move boots around. Again, keep in mind that from his actions downstairs, the Blair creature has no interest anymore in concealing its deeds, so none of this makes sense. So the clothing continuity theory is simply a clothing continuity error, and nothing more. Question number 13. Okay, so finally, here's the big one. Question 13. Go look at my first video and look at every third comment, and they all said the same thing. Didn't John Carpenter himself confirm that one of them was a thing at the end? I got so many comments saying this same thing that it was my primary reason for making this follow-up. Sure, there were other things to discuss, but this was the big one, and every single person commented it to me like it was a huge gotcha revelation and the be-all, end-all answer. So, let's see. Okay, looks like back in 2012, a Twitter user asked if Mac or Childs was a thing at the end of the movie, and Carpenter responded and said, yes, one of them was a thing. Oh, okay. I guess I'm wrong. I guess that's it. Case closed. Question over. I guess that's it for the episode. I guess that seals it. Except, Yes, I know he said this, but let's look a bit deeper, shall we? Well, over the years, JC has been asked about the ending literally hundreds of times, and his answer has changed almost every time. His most common answer is, I don't know. But at several convention appearances, he has apparently answered, I don't care. His most clear answer had been in an interview with Outpost 31, an online fan site, and when asked if Childs was a thing, he said he didn't know, but believed that MacReady was a thing. Then, in the same interview, when pressed about it, said that he was BSing about Mac, and that, I quote, I have no idea. Nobody does. Even producer Stuart Cohen has reinforced that with stating that while shooting, they had no clear answer as to if one of them was infected, but let's look at what came after. There was a comic book follow-up that Carpenter at least approved in which both characters were revealed to be human. I know there's some confusion from some of my commenters as Childs does eventually reveal himself to be a thing, but if you read the entire series, he is taken at the ending of the first volume, when Childs and a duplicated man named Erskine are seemingly killed in a submarine with only Max surviving. In Volume 2, when Childs shows up miraculously surviving, it's because he has been thinged up. But a blood test in the first volume shows that according to the comic, both men are human, although this is not really canon, so it can be discounted. Also of note is the fact that Carpenter said back in 2004 that he had a story idea for The Thing 2 that he wanted to make that involved both Childs and Max surviving and facing a new threat after being rescued. But no further details are out there, so it's really no help. Also not canon is the original ending to the film, which was apparently at least partially shot, in which Mac is rescued and revealed to be human with no mention of Childs at all, but again, not canon. But what about the one that is canon, apparently? Carpenter has stated that the 2002 video game was an in-canon continuation of the movie, and that it is the true sequel. In that game, Childs is revealed to be dead, frozen in the snow, and human. Mac is missing, but appears alive at the end, rescuing the game's hero and helping destroy the Thing's end boss form. If Mac was a thing, he would have no motivation to save the character and assist in destroying part of itself, so you can safely assume he's human, so through this, Carpenter has apparently signed off on saying that they're both human. So just know from this point on that if you're going to cite the fact that Carpenter said that one of them was a thing, you're literally picking one answer out of several given to fit your point of view. You know what's more important to me than Carpenter's words, though, especially since my whole argument depends on script clues? The writers. And according to Stuart Cohen, Bill Lancaster, who wrote the script, 100% believed both men to be human and wrote the final scene as a poetic finale with two human men who couldn't trust each other having one last drink together before freezing to death. Cohen states that he also shares that belief, and so do I. So there you have it. That's 13 more questions about The Thing. I have a feeling that this is going to close the book on the questions of The Thing, although I'm sure that there's probably more questions. I don't know if there'll be enough for a part 3 of this, but you never know. I didn't think that there was going to be a part 2, so I guess the time will tell in the future. We'll see what happens. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed those answers. Let me know if you agree with me or disagree with me. I'm going to guess that a lot of you are going to let me know that you disagree with me down below. That's fine. Go ahead. Let's hear the comments. Let's hear what you have to say back. I'm curious to see it. Like, subscribe, share this out to everybody. Please check out my patrons over here. These guys help get these videos made, and you can too by going to patreon.com/movietimelines and signing up to help the channel. I appreciate you watching this video, and I thank you, and I'll see you very shortly for another great video. Thanks, guys.